"Mr. Thompson, there's a problem. This child doesn't match your DNA." The words didn't echo. They landed. Hard. Final. And for a man who built his entire life on certainty, that single sentence carried more weight than any loss, any deal, any risk he had ever faced. Marcus Thompson didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, because men like him don't react without understanding the full picture first. They assess, they calculate, they regain control. But there was nothing to calculate here. No angle to negotiate, no leverage to pull, just a newborn child, and a truth that refused to bend. Marcus had spent decades building a world where outcomes followed intention, where every variable could be managed, every person predicted. From a modest upbringing in Ohio to the top floors of New York's financial elite, he had turned discipline into dominance. His company moved billions across supply chains, his decisions influenced industries, and his name carried authority in rooms where power was the only language spoken. He didn't gamble. He didn't guess. He knew. Or at least, he believed he did. So when he married Sarah Mitchell, it wasn't a reckless decision. It was deliberate. Calculated. She was younger. Yes. Different. Certainly, but she represented something he couldn't quantify, and for reasons he didn't fully admit to himself, that made her more valuable, not less. She didn't chase his attention. She didn't adjust herself to fit his world. And that absence of need, that quiet independence, convinced Marcus he had found something real, something untouched by the expectations that usually surrounded him. But standing in that hospital room, with a doctor waiting for a response and a reality he couldn't reshape, Marcus felt something unfamiliar begin to take hold. Not fear. Not yet. Something quieter. Something slower. A question forming beneath the surface of everything he thought he understood. If this child wasn't his, then when exactly had things started to change? Because moments like this don't come out of nowhere. They build. Quietly, piece by piece, hidden inside ordinary days, overlooked conversations, small decisions that don't seem important at the time. And by the time the truth arrives, it doesn't introduce itself as something new. It reveals what was already there. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Thompson had built a reputation on seeing what others missed, on identifying risk before it surfaced, on reading people with precision that made mistakes rare and costly for anyone who underestimated him. Yet standing in that hospital, faced with a result that contradicted everything he believed to be true, one question refused to stay buried. Who was Sarah Mitchell, really? Because the woman he married, the woman who carried his name, the woman now lying in that hospital bed, no longer fit the version of reality he had trusted without hesitation. And if her truth had been hidden, then it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about how a man like Marcus Thompson, a man who controlled outcomes for a living, failed to recognize the one variable that mattered most. The deeper that question settled in, the more unsettling the next became. How did one of the most powerful men in America miss the signs? Not overlook them, not ignore them, miss them entirely. Because this wasn't a minor detail or a simple misunderstanding. This was something fundamental, something that suggested the presence of gaps in a system Marcus believed was flawless. And if those gaps existed, then they didn't just affect his marriage. They reached into every decision he had ever made, every judgment he trusted, every certainty he built his identity on. Then came the final question, the one that carried a weight far heavier than the others. Why did the truth come out at the worst possible moment? Not earlier, when it could have been contained, not later, when it might have been managed, but now. At the exact point where everything was exposed, where there was no room to adjust, no space to recover quietly. Timing like that is rarely accidental. It forces consequences into the open. It removes control. It demands answers. And as these questions began to take shape, one realization became impossible to avoid. Whatever happened here didn't begin in that hospital room. It didn't start with the doctor's words or the test results or the shock that followed. It started much earlier, in moments that seemed insignificant at the time, in choices that didn't appear dangerous, in details that were easy to dismiss until they weren't. Because stories like this don't announce themselves when they begin. They unfold slowly, building beneath the surface until the truth can no longer stay hidden. To understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning. Marcus Thompson didn't rise by chance. He built everything with discipline, structure, and a refusal to leave anything unchecked. Growing up just outside Columbus, he learned early that trust could cost you everything if placed in the wrong hands, so he stopped relying on it. By 36, he had turned that mindset into power, running a logistics empire where every detail was measured, every risk calculated, and every outcome controlled before it could shift against him. People respected him because he was consistent. Predictable in the way success demands. Nothing in his world moved without his awareness. At least, that's what he believed. Sarah Mitchell disrupted that belief the moment he met her. At 22, she carried a quiet composure that didn't adjust to his presence. She knew exactly who he was, but there was no change in her tone, no attempt to impress, no reaction that followed the pattern Marcus expected. That absence caught his attention immediately. It wasn't admiration that drew him in, it was resistance. Not open defiance, but something more controlled. Something that stayed just beyond his reach. For Marcus, that made her different. And different meant worth understanding. He approached her the same way he approached everything else, observing, asking, building a clear picture piece by piece. But Sarah never gave him the full view. She answered questions without revealing too much, shared parts of her past while leaving gaps he couldn't close. She spoke about struggle, about independence, about wanting a better life, and every word sounded right. Yet something never fully connected. Marcus noticed it, but instead of confronting it, he adjusted. Because in his world, uncertainty didn't last. It resolved. What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah had already studied him long before they met. While he believed he was learning her, she already understood him, his habits, his decisions, his need for control. And that gave her an advantage he never considered. She knew exactly how far to go, how much to reveal, how to remain close without ever being fully seen. That distance wasn't accidental. It was maintained. Carefully. When Marcus brought her into his world, she adapted quickly. But she didn't change. Surrounded by wealth, influence, and expectation, she remained the same person he met in that quiet lobby. Calm. Observant. Unmoved. Others noticed it. Some admired it. Others questioned it. Marcus ignored both. To him, her independence proved something real, something he couldn't buy or control, and that made him trust her more, not less. But outside his world, there were doubts he couldn't manage. Sarah's mother saw something Marcus didn't. She didn't question his success, she questioned what came with it. In a quiet moment, she asked Sarah a question that carried more weight than it seemed. Does he make you feel safe? It wasn't about money, it wasn't about comfort. It was about whether control could ever feel like security. Sarah didn't answer immediately. And that pause, brief but undeniable, revealed something neither of them chose to confront. Because what Marcus offered was structure. What Sarah needed might have been something else entirely. And when those two things don't align, the difference doesn't stay hidden. It grows. Slowly, quietly, until it reaches a point where it can't be ignored anymore. Marcus Thompson moved quickly once he decided something had value. Hesitation wasn't part of his process, and with Sarah Mitchell, he saw enough to move forward without delay. Dinners turned into weekends, weekends into shared routines, and before long, What began as curiosity became commitment. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked decisive, even ideal. A powerful man choosing a woman who didn't chase him, a relationship forming without chaos, without resistance. But speed can hide what patience would expose, and Marcus didn't slow down long enough to question what he couldn't fully see. Sarah adapted to his world with ease, stepping into environments shaped by influence without appearing overwhelmed or overly impressed. She learned quickly, observed quietly, and spoke only when necessary. That composure reinforced Marcus's belief that he had made the right decision. Yet within that calm, there were moments that didn't quite align. Questions about her past were answered briefly, then redirected. Details that should have connected remained separate, and while Marcus noticed, he chose not to interrupt the momentum he had already set in motion. Because stopping to examine uncertainty would mean acknowledging it existed. As their relationship deepened, those small inconsistencies became harder to ignore. Sarah began taking calls she wouldn't explain, ending conversations the moment Marcus entered the room. Messages appeared, then disappeared, leaving no trace beyond the timing. There were nights when she felt present but distant, physically there yet emotionally unreachable in ways Marcus couldn't define. Each moment alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that didn't follow logic. Still, Marcus didn't confront it directly. Instead, he adjusted his approach. Control had always been his solution. When something didn't make sense, he applied pressure, increased awareness, reduced uncertainty until clarity emerged. With Sarah, he began doing the same. More questions, more attention, more subtle attempts to understand what remained just out of reach. But unlike every other situation he had managed before, this one didn't respond the way he expected. The more he tried to understand her, the less she revealed. The news came at a moment Marcus Thompson wasn't expecting it. Delivered without build-up, without hesitation, and without the kind of emotion he had imagined would come with it. Sarah Mitchell stood across from him, calm as always, and told him she was pregnant. For a brief second, everything aligned the way it was supposed to. A future he had already envisioned suddenly felt closer, more real, more permanent. Legacy, family, continuation of everything he had spent his life building. It was the one outcome that fit perfectly within the structure he trusted. And yet, even as that realization settled in, something else surfaced alongside it. Not strong enough to interrupt the moment, but present enough to remain. Marcus responded the way he always did when faced with something significant. He assessed. He measured. He placed the information within a timeline, aligning it with memory, with movement, with everything he could verify. And that's where the first inconsistency appeared. Subtle, easy to overlook, but once noticed, impossible to ignore completely. The timing didn't align as cleanly as it should have, not enough to prove anything, not enough to confront directly, but enough to create a pause in his thinking that hadn't been there before. Sarah's reaction added to it. There was no hesitation in her words, no visible uncertainty, but there was also something missing. The emotional response Marcus expected wasn't fully there. No excitement that matched the magnitude of the moment. No shift in tone that reflected what this meant for both of them. She delivered the news the same way she delivered everything else. Controlled. Measured. Almost as if she had already processed it long before he had the chance to hear it. Marcus didn't question her immediately. He didn't challenge the timing or the tone, because doing so would require him to admit that something didn't feel right, and that wasn't a position he was used to accepting. Instead, he moved forward, focusing on what could still fit within his understanding, convincing himself that any gaps would eventually close. But the clarity he expected never came. That was the moment everything started to feel off. By the time Sarah Mitchell was rushed into the hospital, Marcus Thompson had already shifted into the only mode he trusted. Control. He made calls before the car even stopped, cleared space, ensured the best staff were ready, removed every possible delay. This was a situation he could manage, a process he could oversee, something that followed structure. But the moment the doors closed behind her, that certainty began to break. Inside, everything moved faster than he could track. Voices overlapped. Instructions came sharp and direct. Staff moved with urgency that didn't wait for acknowledgement. Monitors flickered with numbers he couldn't interpret fast enough. Marcus stood there, watching a system he didn't control unfold in real time, and for the first time in years, his presence didn't change anything. No one paused for him. No one adjusted. The environment moved on its own terms, and he was forced to follow. He tried to stay focused, to hold on to something familiar, but the pace left no space for it. Every second carried weight. Every decision happened without him. And as much as he wanted to step in, to take control, there was nothing to take. Only movement, only pressure, only uncertainty. Sarah remained at the center of it all, surrounded by people, yet distant in a way Marcus couldn't reach. He caught brief glimpses of her expression, moments where she seemed aware of everything happening but not reacting in the way he expected. Not fear, not panic. Something quieter, something controlled. And that difference, subtle but present, only deepened the unease that had been building long before they arrived. Marcus shifted his attention to the details, searching for something that made sense, something he could anchor himself to, but the more he observed, the less stable everything felt. Timing blurred. Conversations overlapped. Information came in fragments, none of it complete enough to form a clear picture. And then, the doctor saw something that didn't make sense. The confirmation didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, each one harder to dismiss than the last. The initial result suggested a mismatch. A follow-up test removed any doubt. The child did not share Marcus Thompson's D.N.A. There was no ambiguity left to interpret, no technical error to lean on, no explanation that could restore what had just been taken from him. For a man who relied on certainty, this wasn't confusion. It was disruption at the highest level. Marcus didn't react emotionally. He shifted into action. Quietly. Precisely. The same way he handled risk in business, he approached this the only way he knew how. He began with verification, hospital records, lab confirmations, independent analysis. Every result returned the same conclusion. That forced the next step. Sarah Mitchell. Not the version of her he knew, but the one that existed beyond what she had chosen to share. He started with the basics. Background checks that extended further than anything he had previously requested. Financial traces, old addresses, employment records. What he found didn't contradict her story completely, but it didn't support it either. There were gaps, periods of time with no clear record, locations that didn't connect cleanly, information that felt adjusted rather than false. Enough to raise questions, not enough to answer them. Marcus pushed further. Communications, contacts, patterns. He uncovered numbers that had no names attached, repeated connections that didn't appear in her known circle. Then came something more concrete, a name linked to her past that she had never mentioned. Not recent, not current, but not distant enough to ignore. That discovery shifted everything. Because now this wasn't just about missing information. It was about hidden information. As Marcus traced that connection, the timeline began to take shape in a way that felt impossible to ignore. Overlaps appeared where there shouldn't have been any. Moments where Sarah's movements didn't align with what she had told him. The kind of details that wouldn't stand out on their own, but together formed a pattern that carried weight. And within that pattern, one possibility began to surface. Not confirmed, not proven, but present. The deeper he looked, the worse it became. By the time Marcus Thompson reached the final set of results, there was nothing left to interpret. Every test aligned. Every report confirmed the same outcome. The child was not his. No technical error, no procedural mistake, no alternate explanation waiting to correct itself. The truth was fixed, and for the first time in his life, Marcus was forced to accept something he could not reframe or control. What he had believed, what he had trusted, what he had built his future around no longer existed in the form he understood. But the result alone wasn't the most damaging part. It was what came after. Because as Marcus continued tracing Sarah Mitchell's past, connecting details that had once seemed unrelated, a different picture began to emerge. This wasn't a single mistake. It wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a situation that spiraled beyond control. The gaps, the timing, the hidden connections, they didn't point to randomness. They suggested direction, intent. Sarah hadn't just withheld information. She had structured it, carefully, deliberately. The way she entered his life, the way she revealed pieces of herself while keeping others hidden, the way she remained just outside his ability to fully understand her. It all began to align in a way that forced a question Marcus had avoided until now. What if none of this was accidental? That realization hit harder than the test results ever could. Because this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about losing control in a way Marcus had never experienced. Every decision he thought he made independently now carried doubt. Every moment he believed was genuine now felt uncertain. And beyond the personal impact, there was something else he couldn't ignore. Exposure. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a husband. He was a public figure. A name tied to influence, credibility, authority. And if this situation reached beyond private walls, it wouldn't remain personal for long. It would become narrative, speculation, judgment, the kind of attention that doesn't fade quietly. For a man who built his life on control, the truth didn't just take something from him, it left him exposed in a way he couldn't contain. Marcus Thompson expected confrontation. Evidence laid out. Questions answered directly. A moment where control could be reasserted, even if only partially. Instead, what he found was absence. Sarah Mitchell was gone. No explanation delivered in person. No final conversation, just space where she had been, and a silence that carried more weight than any argument could have. The apartment showed no signs of urgency, no indication of panic. Everything was deliberate, clean, intentional, as if she had planned not only what to take, but what to leave behind. Marcus searched for anything that could restore clarity. A trace, a mistake, something incomplete. What he found instead was a single message. Not long, not emotional, not written to provoke reaction, just a statement, placed where he would see it, where it couldn't be ignored or misinterpreted. You never loved me. You loved control. He read it more than once, not because he didn't understand it, but because of what it implied. Every moment he had replayed, every decision he believed was his, every conclusion he trusted, all of it now stood under a different light. If Sarah had planned her exit the same way she structured everything else, then this wasn't an ending created by circumstance. It was a conclusion she had already decided long before he realized anything was wrong. Marcus had spent years building a life where outcomes followed intention, where variables were contained, where nothing moved without his awareness. Yet here he stood, facing a result he never saw coming, left with questions that didn't resolve, answers that didn't restore anything, and a reality that refused to align with the system he trusted. In the end, the one thing Marcus couldn't buy was the truth. What would you have done in Marcus Thompson's position, standing there with everything you believed in suddenly replaced by something you couldn't explain or control? Would you have kept digging, searching for answers no matter where they led? Or would you have accepted what was in front of you and walked away before it took even more from you? And what about Sarah Mitchell? Was this something she designed from the beginning? A sequence of choices leading to a precise outcome? Or was there another layer still hidden beneath everything that's been revealed? Because the more you look at it, the harder it becomes to separate intention from circumstance, and that uncertainty changes how you see every moment that came before. Would you have trusted her, knowing what Marcus knew? Or would you have questioned the signs earlier? The details that didn't quite align, the silence where clarity should have been. These are the questions that don't come with easy answers. The kind that stay with you long after the story ends, forcing you to reconsider what trust really means when certainty disappears. If this story made you think differently, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you think this story was shocking, the next one will change how you see trust forever.